The city skyline shimmered with gold and glass, a testament to wealth and power. Inside the tallest tower, where the windows overlooked everything below, a man stood motionless. Richard Hale, a billionaire whose empire spanned continents, stared blankly at the monitors that displayed his son's medical stats. His only child, 8-year-old Ethan, lay in a hospital bed connected to tubes and machines, his breathing shallow, his skin pale like paper. Doctors had tried everything, every experimental treatment, every drug that money could buy, but nothing worked. Ethan's rare heart condition had worsened overnight. Now, the boy's heart was failing, and time was running out. The hospital's chief surgeon, Dr. Evans, stood near the doorway, his expression grave. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, "we've reached the limit of what we can do. Ethan's condition is beyond medical reversal. We can only make him comfortable now." Richard turned his head slowly, disbelief etched into his face. "You mean to tell me," he said, his voice trembling, "that with all my resources, all my money, you can't save my son?" Dr. Evans looked down. "I'm sorry." Richard's voice cracked as he whispered, "There has to be someone, something." But the silence that followed was the kind that broke a man. Down in the same hospital, in the janitor's quarters, another man was finishing his shift. Daniel Cole, a single father of a 7-year-old boy named Liam, was mopping the floor when he overheard two nurses whispering about the billionaire's dying son. He didn't pay much attention. After all, the problems of the rich were galaxies away from his own. Daniel was struggling to pay rent, and his son had been coughing all week. But when he heard the nurses mention the word heart, something inside him stirred. Liam had been born with the same rare condition, one that had nearly taken his life years ago. Daniel had spent every penny he had on surgeries, and when those failed, he turned to unconventional help, a retired military medic named Walter who lived on the outskirts of town. Walter had taught Daniel an unorthodox treatment technique, part science, part miracle, involving electrical resuscitation synchronized with manual cardiac massage. It had saved Liam's life once when doctors had given up. As Daniel leaned on his mop, something told him to go to the upper floors. He didn't know why, only that he couldn't ignore it. He found himself outside Ethan Hale's room. Through the glass, he saw the child lying motionless, surrounded by machines that beeped faintly. Richard Hale sat beside the bed, his head in his hands. Daniel hesitated. A janitor walking into the billionaire's private ward could mean losing his job, maybe worse. But then he saw Ethan's small fingers twitch weakly. That was enough. He stepped in quietly. "Sir." Richard looked up sharply. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry, sir," Daniel said softly, gripping his mop handle nervously. "I just heard about your boy. I know I shouldn't be here, but maybe I can help." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "You're a janitor," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "You think you can do what my doctors couldn't?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm not a doctor, sir. But I've seen something work when medicine failed. Please, just give me a chance." Dr. Evans entered the room at that moment, anger flashing in his eyes. "Who let this man in here?" "Security." "Wait." Richard raised his hand. His gaze stayed locked on Daniel's face. "What are you proposing?" Daniel took a step closer, his voice calm but desperate. "I can restart his heart using a combination of pressure, timing, and low-voltage shock. It's risky. But you've got nothing left to lose." Dr. Evans scoffed. "This is absurd. You'll kill him." Richard's jaw tightened. He turned to the doctor. "You said he's dying anyway." The room went still. For the first time in hours, there was a sliver of hope in Richard's eyes. "Do it," he said finally. Dr. Evans protested. "Mr. Hale, this man has no credentials." "I said do it." Daniel's hands trembled as he approached the bed. He looked at the fragile child and whispered under his breath, "Hold on, kid." He unplugged one of the machines, used the cord to draw a small electrical arc, then pressed his palms to Ethan's chest. The shock jolted through his arms. The boy's body convulsed. Nothing. Daniel repeated the process, adjusting the rhythm, counting softly, 1, 2, breathe. Sweat poured down his forehead. Dr. Evans watched in silent disbelief, ready to stop him at any moment. After the third attempt, Ethan's monitor flatlined. The sound pierced the room like a knife. Richard turned away, his shoulders shaking. But then, faintly, a flicker appeared on the screen. Beep. Then another. Beep. Beep. Daniel froze, his hands still on the boy's chest. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, his lips parted, and a weak whisper escaped. Dad. Richard spun around, his face pale. Ethan. He rushed to the bedside, grabbing his son's hand. I'm here, son. I'm right here. Tears streamed down his face as the room filled with gasps. Even drive. Evans was speechless, staring at the monitor in disbelief. Daniel stepped back, breathing heavily, his shirt soaked with sweat. His pulse is stabilizing. Drive. Evans murmured, checking the readings. This shouldn't be possible. Richard turned to Daniel, stunned. What did you do? Daniel shook his head. I just helped his heart remember how to beat. Security arrived minutes later, but Richard ordered them to stand down. He walked to Daniel and held out his hand. You saved my son's life, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I owe you everything. Daniel looked away modestly. You don't owe me anything, sir. I just did what I could. But the story didn't end there. The next day, every major news outlet ran the headline, Billionaire's son saved by hospital janitor. Cameras surrounded the hospital. Reporters swarmed Daniel as he tried to leave after his shift. Mr. Cole, how did you do it? One shouted. Are you a former doctor? Another asked. Daniel just smiled weakly. No, ma'am. I'm just a dad who didn't stop believing. Richard Hale, however, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had built his empire on control, on science, on certainty. But here was a man who had saved his child through faith, courage, and love. That evening, Richard invited Daniel and Liam to his penthouse. The contrast between their worlds couldn't have been starker. Liam in his hand-me-down jacket, staring wide-eyed at the glass walls and chandeliers, and Richard in his tailored suit, standing silently by the window. You live up here? Liam asked innocently. Richard smiled faintly. Yes, but it feels empty most days. Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. We should go, sir. I didn't mean to intrude. Stay, Richard said quickly. I wanted to thank you properly. He opened a small box on the table. Inside was a check, blank, unsigned. Name your price, he said. Whatever you want. Daniel looked at the check for a long time, then pushed it back gently. I don't want your money, sir. Just promise me you'll spend time with him. Every minute counts. Richard stared at him, speechless. In all his years of wealth and power, no one had ever refused him. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's health improved rapidly. He began walking again, laughing, even playing with Liam when they visited. The two boys became inseparable. Richard often watched them together, realizing that the man who had saved his son wasn't just someone who fixed a broken heart, he was someone who reminded him what a father truly was. One afternoon, Richard approached Daniel as they watched the boys play in the hospital garden. You know, he said, you could do more with what you know. That method you used, it could save lives. Daniel nodded slowly. I've thought about it, but I'd need help. Equipment. Funding. Richard smiled. Then let me be that help. Months later, a new medical foundation was established, the Ethan and Liam Hart Foundation, dedicated to developing affordable life-saving cardiac techniques for children. Daniel was its first director, working alongside doctors who once dismissed him. The world hailed him as a hero, but Daniel always said the same thing when interviewed. I didn't save a billionaire's son. I just did what any father would do. Years later, when Ethan and Liam graduated high school together, Richard stood beside Daniel, clapping proudly. He turned and said quietly, You changed my life that night. Daniel smiled. No, sir. Your son did. He reminded both of us what matters most. As the crowd cheered, Richard looked up at the sky. The memory of that hospital room, the beeping monitors, the fear, the miracle, still echoed in his heart. Money had once made him powerful. But it was compassion, born from a poor man's courage, that made him human again. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of life returning, two fathers shared a truth no fortune could ever buy. Sometimes the richest hearts belong to those who have the least.